Okay, it's just gone 4:15, so maybe we should begin. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us for this last session. You made it through the day. I'm going to be chairing this session. My name is Joel. It's a session on infrastructure. Just to open, I thought I'd begin as most undergraduate essays begin with a definition of infrastructure. You know, we use it so often, but and I use it. I'm using it in my own research. But I was interested actually that the definition implies something underneath. Infra denotes something underneath, an underlying foundation or basic framework of an organization or a system. And I think in this definition, we have both of the kind of physical, as much as the, sorry, is that better? Okay. We get as much as of the physical as well as the ideational aspects of infrastructure, that infrastructure is as much about concrete and steel as it is about ideas. And for this reason, it's also the site of politics. And I think today's presenters will really, from what I've read, touch on both of those about how colonial infrastructure, about aspects of colonial infrastructure, its intrusion into conquered lands, it's the kind of contests it evoked, its repurposing, its abandonment, and also acts of sabotage against it. I'm not sure if you followed the recent news story about the colonial pipeline. I mean, that was hacked by ransomware. You know, if you're going to name your company Colonial, you've got it coming. So anyway, these are pertinent continuing debates. So we've got four presentations. It's a really international panel. So first we're going to have Giorgio Misha and Rafael Peniola, both from the University of Basel. They'll be presenting on South African railway spaces, attempts and frustrations in small towns. Then we'll have Bruno Vedder and Enrico Dodi, both architects from Maputo, Mozambique. They'll be looking at colonial legacies, heritage, cultural identity, and sustainable development in Gaza, Mozambique. Then we'll have Robbie Fives from Ghent University. We'll speak on forms of violence along the Matadi-Kinshasa railway line. And then finally, Ariana Lissoni from Wits University will be blowing up apartheid, looking at MK's strategic targets from sabotage to armed propaganda. So let's begin with Giorgio and Rafael, please. And you'll have 15 to 20 minutes. I'll indicate time.
Okay, I should start, but I still confronted with technical problems, which I will solve in a minute. Okay. This photographic view, can you show the photograph, please? This photographic view of the railway station from a bridge in the air provides a sense of the dramatic decline of railway transport in South Africa during the past decades. With no train in sight, the many tracks, power lines and platforms that dominate the picture have seemingly lost their purpose. The railway infrastructure, overgrown by shrubs, bears no perceivable meaning anymore. The photograph evokes nostalgia, highlighting present abandonment while implying past grandeur. As such, the image captures the contradiction of South African Railways history. In the 20th century, South Africa had an extensive railway network operated by the National Railway Company, SAR, existing since 1910. The specific geography of South Africa's railway network becomes visible on this map, entitled Standard Railway Map of South Africa, and published by the company in 1929. Main trunk line lines linked the coast with the mining and population centers in the interior, namely the area today known as Gauteng, with various cross connections creating a cluster of railway junctions. Local feeder lines leading to distant railway heads in the rural hinterland complemented the network. As the maps suggests, SAR's network was not limited to South Africa, but expanded far beyond the country's border into neighboring territories. In particular, today's Namibia was an integral part of SAR's network. In a nutshell, it was through SAR's sophisticated rail and road transport network that people and goods moved within and beyond South Africa's national borders for most of the 20th century. In the mid-1970s, though, SAR lost its transport monopoly and a steady decline began, culminating in the closure of many railway lines and the near-complete collapse of long-distance passenger traffic in the 1990s. Next. The demise of SAR resulted in the decay and abandonment of its infrastructure. A proud railway giant turned into material debris scattered all over the landscape, sometimes hidden in the open field on the edge of settlements, and other times right in the middle of cities and towns, especially in former railway towns, which owed their existence and prosperity to the railways. The decay is today most visible and felt. In our paper, a draft version is uploaded. We reflect on the ways in which colonial and post-colonial society have and continue to deal with the material and symbolic heritage of South Africa's railway empire, whereby we focus on two specific locations: the former railway towns of De Aar in South Africa and Usakos in Namibia. They are indicated on the map. De Aar and Usakos owe their existence, growth and prosperity to the railways, which shaped the town's urban landscapes. Starting with De Aar, let us now shortly sketch what the decline of the railway meant for these two towns and what answers it triggered among residents. The rise of SAR was a process that took several decades. Equally, we have to understand the railway's decline as a process and not as an event. A comparison of the two railway towns allows us to raise questions about the nature and uneven dynamics of industrial decline, which we cannot fully answer yet. De Aar is no longer the prosperous railway town it used to be for almost a century. However, thanks to still being administrative and economic center in the region, the town's role shifted, though to a less lucrative function, with population numbers continuing to grow to over 30,000 people. At present, there are practically no more trains and nobody works at De Aar's operating center. Nevertheless, SAR, today known as Transnet, continues to shape De Aar's urban landscape. As in the past, the huge railway yard defines the spatial layout of the town and separates the generally designed former white part from the poor neighborhoods on the other side of the railway line. Despite its enormous size, the railway yard, once the beating heart of the town's economy, has figuratively moved to the edge. Today, residents seem largely indifferent to the railways and its historical importance, and young township dwellers in particular resent the ways in which decaying infrastructure affects, for instance, their mobility between segregated neighborhoods. Few have access to motorized transport or bicycles, and many use the old pedestrian bridge that takes them over the railway yard. at night, and especially for women who walk alone. Crossing the bridge was and is associated with fear. You can see this bridge from the pedestrian perspective in the image currently shown. The very same bridge from which the first photograph of this presentation was taken. For residents of the townships, the railway yard remains a physical barrier that separates their residential areas from the economic center of town. Older generations, in contrast, preserve strong memories of a prosperous past linked to the railways, although Black residents ambiguously place SAR at the heart of apartheid. The recollections of white former railway workers, finally, are positive, and they cherish the railways, even if there is no significant public or private initiative for the preservation of railway heritage in the yard. Only an old steam locomotive rests silently on a side track on the railway yard.
So let us now move to our second example, which is Uzakos. The most impressive material remains of railway pasts in Uzakos is the railway workshop, which you can see in the picture. Once the biggest building in the colony, it today belongs to Namibia's national railway company, Transnamib, and it still commands a kind of oppressive majesty. It is but one of Uzakos's railway ruins that are scattered across the urban landscape and define the town's spatial layout. These ruins include emptied administrative buildings, former railway houses, and scrap that has been repurposed and turned into everyday implements, but still bears traces of its original use. Our interest in Uzakos stems from the town's preoccupation with reclaiming its past linked to the railways in a way that attends to the multiplicity of historical experience and the diversity of local forms and practices of memorialization. We believe their approach to be transformative in that it proposes productive paths towards a post-colonial historical imagination. In 2015, an exhibition that used a remarkable photographic collection from Uzakos's old location, collected and curated by 4 local women, inaugurated a community museum project. The new museum project tied in with the municipality's previous interest to establish a local cultural institution. But more importantly, it resonated with young local activists, artists, and community members. And actually, some of these young activists are in tomorrow's program, so I would warmly invite you to listen to their contribution. Multiple, at times conflicting interests cluster around this museum project, but there is a widely shared commitment to establishing a unique museum that acknowledges recent, community-focused and community-sourced pasts. The museum project actively wants to distinguish itself from those parts of the Namibian museum sector that remain deeply rooted in settler historiography. Railway history constitutes one of the key domains in which these historiographical and representational shifts are meant to occur. We wish to highlight especially 2 concerns that chart the direction these discussions have taken in Uzakos. The first one relates to the exhibiting of a German steam locomotive situated next to Uzakos's neglected train station. Henschel locomotive HD40 was in use on Namibia's so-called narrow gauge tracks until the early 1960s. At this stage, so in this same time, key SAR activities were relocated away from Uzakos, and the implementation of apartheid urban planning and forced removals deeply changed the town's urban fabric. It is against this backdrop of fatal economic decline and grave social disruption that Southwest Africa's Monuments Commission was cynically concerned with bequeathing this locomotive monument as a farewell gift to Uzakos, as they called it in an archival document. The years have taken a toll on locomotive HD40, as you can see in the image, which is why ideas surrounding the integration of this locomotive to the future museum's collection have focused on restoration. However, alternative approaches are being formulated as well. Interviewed Black former railway workers expressed the wish for the restoration of material railway relics in town and the return of materials that moved with the railway in the early 1960s. They link restoration and return to hopes for economic prosperity and thus showcase the historical complexity and the contemporary resonance of railway modernity beyond sort of this idea that it would only resonate with the settler society. Restoring the locomotive might in some ways emulate the apartheid regime's obsession with European engineering. But at present, it also speaks to railway enthusiasts and former workers alike. And thus, renovating sits uncomfortably with dichotomous distinctions made by decades of apartheid rule and colonialism. However, restoration and repair likely run the risk of obliterating signifiers of labor history and deindustrialization inscribed in the locomotive, such as replacement parts, dents, and rust. Highlighting these facets of railway materiality might link the locomotive more directly and meaningfully to Usakos's broader memorial landscape. Those involved in conceptualizing the Usakos Museum have lately shifted their conversations, therefore, to these complexities and contradictions embodied in local railway heritage. They consider, for example, now to do artistic reworkings of the locomotive, which would retain its current state of decay then. This could situate the object in the context of oral history and memory work, which the museum activists are interested in and which privileges subaltern perspectives. It is important to note that these initiatives are being developed in a context that remains controlled by Transnami, and hence by corporate capital and centralized economic and political power located in Namibia's capital, Windhoek. In other words, local and grassroots initiatives in the heritage sector continue to meet with resistance, albeit under new post-colonial dispensation. Furthermore, there's a preoccupation with how curatorial conceptions of the museum and the treatment of railway objects will resonate with different audiences, given that the colonial nostalgic registers remain disturbingly popular among sections of Namibian society and international tourists. The stakes are high, given that museums are considered important assets in the tourist sector and accordingly raise expectations for economic development. And there are many such economic expectations in Usakos. But local museum activists are aware and try to navigate these tensions. The second thing we'd like to highlight are Usakos Museum's concerns with land and landscape, and with forms of navigating the railway's presence in town as part of the museum's experience. Usakos's urban environment is deeply marked by the railways and histories of colonial dispossession, racial segregation, and urban planning. But the infrastructural remains and the built environment inherited from South African railways also provide a material foundation for understanding the town's urban, social, and aesthetic landscapes in ways that transcend historical fragmentation along lines of race and class. Ongoing debates about the integration of railway objects in practices of memorialization and remembrance, which include collecting and curating these objects, documenting oral histories, but also designing tours around town that engage with railway ruins, all pertain to these efforts. In conclusion, in Usakos, differently than in DR, railway pasts and presents remain important, and hopes for a return to former economic prosperity and infrastructural grandeur are substantiated by the persisting presence of the railway as an important landowner. This might maybe explain why residents push for a new engagement with the past and pursue a local museum project. This envisioned museum is part of an effort to draw on railway pasts in order to imagine an inclusive future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your paper too. And as the grandson of a carpenter who worked for the railway, I guess I'm also a relic of, I'm a legacy of the railways. Thanks very much. Let's move on to Bruno Vedder and Enrico Dordi, please. Enrico? Is Bruno with us?
Lucas.
There's some feedback there, Enrico.
Yes, Lucas, you go ahead.
Apri dove è scritto avvia video e anche il microfono, se no non si sente.
Enrico, the sound that's in the background, can you mute it?
Okay.
Sorry, let me do that again.
Okay.
Enrico, there's a strong echo when you talk. I think try to test.
Impostazioni audio.
Now it seems better.
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. This is not a research work, but it's a story of the project we have been doing for the past 2 years. That is the territorial plan of the province of Gaza. The plan was submitted to the Ministry of Land and Environment last week. Next. Lucas. Okay. Our story begins in Maputo, in front of the Maputo Central Station. CFM stands for Companhia de Ferros de Moçambique. It's classified as one of the most beautiful stations in the world, but Osvaldo, our colleague, will tell the story of this station tomorrow. Next. From the station of Maputo, every year a musical train leaves to go to Maracuene. Maracuene used to be a small town north of Maputo. Now it's part of the metropolitan area of the capital. It celebrates the Marabenta, which is a typical music of Mozambique, which is very much well known in Mozambique and outside. Next. Inside the station, people are waiting to board the special musical train. Next. Traveling. Next. Arriving in Maracuene. Maracuene is a well-known place in Mozambique because in this area took place the Battle of Maracuene, 1895, when the last emperor of Gaza lost with the colonial Portuguese army. Next. So a special festival based on Marabenta, but not only Marabenta music, celebrates this battle of more than 100 years ago. Next. Next. Gungunyana, the last emperor of Gaza, lost his empire in the Battle of Marakwene on the left. The Empire of Gaza was covering the entire province of Gaza, which is the area of our project, but was extending, the Empire of Gaza was extending south to Maputo, north to Inhambane and Manica, and to some parts of South Africa on the east and Zimbabwe in the north. The Empire of Gaza was one of the big African empires. I remember the Shaka in South Africa and the Great Zimbabwe. Next. So this is Ngungunyana, the last emperor of Gaza. Why back? Who was then? Why back? Lucas.
Sorry, it's behaving strangely.
Okay, this is Ngungunyana, who was exiled and died in exile. And on the right, the sculpture with Ngungunyana surrendering to the Portuguese. This sculpture is still in place in Maputo. Next. The first chapter deals with infrastructures. The infrastructures built in colonial period, railways, roads, airports, dams, and power lines are the first chapter of the colonial transformation of the provincial landscape. Next. Of course, roads and bridges are the most important infrastructures. On the left, the Strada Nacional numero 1, and on the right, the bridge on the River Limpopo at the entrance of Xai-Xai, the former João Belo, which is the capital of the province of Gaza. The bridge was built in 1964, and in a flat territory is a sort of landmark. Next. Then railways comes. The black line in the map on the right is the Limpopo Railway from Maputo to Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. It was built by the then Rhodesian Railways to carry copper from Zimbabwe to the port of Maputo. It was damaged during civil war in Mozambique, and it was rehabilitated in the early years of this century. This is an important communication line, and it was entirely built and managed by the Rhodesian at the time when the white racist regimes were thinking that their presence in Southern Africa would last, if not forever, for centuries. And South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Portugal had joined efforts to strengthen this alliance. Next. And this is a small railway based in Xai-Xai. This railway is no more operating. It was destroyed in 2000 with the floods of the River Limpopo. There is a rich running stock in this station, and they are thinking to rehabilitate some of this stock and set up a museum, railway museum. Next. And one of the more biggest impact on the territory is a power line that comes from Cahora Bassa and goes to South Africa. Cahora Bassa was a very controversial project in the 70s, last century. Was built by the South Africa in the Tete province, central Mozambique, to provide electric power to South Africa. Songo is the power station south of the Cahora Bassa Dam, and Apollo is a center for distribution of energy within South Africa. On the photo in the center shows the power lines crossing the Limpopo National Park in the province of Gaza. Next. And to end the presentation of some example of public works done under colonial rule is a Masingir Dam, which is also inside the Limpopo National Park. This dam was, the works for this dam initiated in 1971, but were stopped at the independence in 75 and could resume only after the civil war in Mozambique. So the dam was inaugurated in 2007. Next. And the second chapter of this infrastructure, of the analysis of colonial landscape, deals with the national parks. The province of Gaza has 3 national parks. 2 are completely inside the province. On the left, the Limpopo National Park. In the center, the Banine National Park. And up in the north, the Zinave National Park, which is between Gaza province and the province of Inhambane. Next. As you know, the concept of conservation and national parks was totally not known in colonial times by most of the colonial powers, while in the Western world was architect Olmsted was introducing the idea of classifying some territories to be kept as a future memory for future generations. Is architect Olmsted that designed Central Park in New York and started planning for the conservation area of the Niagara Falls and Yosemite National Park. In Europe, next, the idea and the concept of national parks came at the end of the 19th century. And one of the more ancient national parks is the Swiss National Park in the eastern Switzerland, in Zernetz, and which set a huge territory in the Swiss Alps in total wilderness. No human intervention is being done within this territory. Then other parks joined in all over Europe. And this made possible for some great big mammals like the bear, the wolf, and the lynx to come back, re-establishing a sort of new biodiversity which was lost for many years. Next. In the colonies, no idea of setting up conservation areas. There were some areas which were kept for big game. This was done in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, the then Tanganyika, and in Kenya. You will recognize up on the left and on the extreme right, young Hemingway, who was fond of big game of the so-called big fives. So no conservation area concept was in Southern Africa and especially in Mozambique. The first conservation areas in Mozambique, next, were set as game reserves, the so-called Cruzadas, in the early 60s, last century. So quite recently. No, wait, please. Lucas, back. And only in 2001, the old Cruzadas, that is game reserves, were classified as national parks. On top are some photos of the Limpopo National Parks. On the left, it's the so-called flying rhino. That is to remember and also celebrate the assistance that was provided by South Africa, and especially by the Kruger Park, to bring animals in the Limpopo National Parks and other Mozambican national parks to recreate conditions and to have again big animals. So this is an image which is well known of that period when South Africa was supplying wildlife animals. Next. But not only national parks were newly reorganized and classified in Mozambique, a new exciting project is taking place there, which is the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. These conservation areas includes the Gonarezu National Park in Zimbabwe, the Kruger Parks in South Africa, and the Limpopo, Banine, and Zinave National Parks in Mozambique, and a huge area in between these parks. This project was launched by the Peace Parks Foundation, which was established in 1997 by Nelson Mandela and other prominent international people. The idea behind the transfrontier conservation areas is to bring African countries to join efforts in establishing big conservation areas and promote cooperation, promote a better understanding between the local population and the wildlife and biodiversity. There are many of these projects all over Africa, but the Great Limpopo that covers Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Mozambique is one of the more advanced. It covers, as far as Gaza is concerned, it covers more than half of the province territory. So this project is going to mark in very much the sustainable development of the province, and it has been included as a top priority project in our plan. Next. This is the area of the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Conservation Area. You see in the red dots marks problems, where are the problems between the communities and wildlife, which is a problem the Peace Parks Foundation, in cooperation with the local governments, tries to confront and resolve. The big arrows within this area you see are the ecological corridors to provide space for the animals to move around. This is a big problem when animals are elephants, as you can imagine. Next.
Enrico, we've passed
Yes.
15 minutes, so start wrapping up.
Okay, ending. Okay, next. The third chapter deals with the built environment. This is a monument in Maputo, remembering the fallen soldiers, both Europeans and Africans, in the First World War I. Is still there. Next. This is a plan of the city of Xai-Xai, the only one with a grid of the colonial period. No other settlements are so built in the province. Next. Religious and administrative buildings are rather small. Next. The station of Xai-Xai. Next. Some modern architecture of the colonial times. Next. And then on the border with Zimbabwe, at the end of the railway coming from Maputo and Maracuene, there is a Chiqualaquala. Next. Which is a paradigmatic example of colonial presence. This is the station of Chiqualaquala. Next. And this is the town, the church at the end of the main road, and the station on our shoulders on the other end. Next. Yes, next. Bruno, to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to be very short. I just want to say that can you do the next slide, please? I just want to explain, when we're working on this provincial plan for Gaza province, we bring up with the concept of the sound space and the importance of the music to strengthen the cultural identity on this province and the Mozambican area. It was important for us to do this work and study with the sound space history, because it has a continuity from the historical period, even from the traditional and popular music before colonial occupation, under Portuguese domination, and after independence. We can see those lines, even the influence from South Africa. Please, next slide.
Next.
Even from influence from South Africa, even from the miners on the South African gold mines, and the modern Mozambican music, and the role of cultural and music festivals, as Enrico already spoken on Marabenta and Gaza Montini. Next.
Next.
Now, Maputo has become one of the African musical capitals with some festivals that they happen. And that's what we created on this atmosphere, on this work that we have been working on. Basically, that's all that I wanted to explain, and to bring this new idea and concept of the soundscape. Thank you.
Next. That's all.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that musical journey. Okay, let's move on to Robbie Tevez, please. Robbie, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry. I was trying to find my presentation. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay. Okay, so I think you should see the screen now.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that's very similar to the previous two papers. I will also discuss a colonial railway line, but probably a bit unlike the previous ones. I will talk a bit less about contemporary appropriation of these infrastructures, and stick a little more to the historic analysis. So in my own research, I think the contemporary landscape also figures, or these fragments of imperial debris in the contemporary landscape also figures, but it's rather used as a sort of witness of the historical narratives that I want to bring to the fore. So the railway line I will be discussing today is the one between to
Sorry, Robbie, you seem to be breaking up a bit.
Hi, Joel. It looks like we may have lost Robbie.
All right.
I'm going to try and reconnect with him directly. Joel, just a question. Would it interfere too much with the experience to maybe move on to the next speaker? If you could please
That's
advise.
probably a good idea. Yeah, Ariana, what do you think?
That's fine for me.
Thank you.
So should I go ahead?
Yes,
And
please,
then
yeah.
we'll get Robbie after me.
Okay,
Sure.
sorry, apparently the internet connection at my home dropped out all of a sudden.
There we go. Okay. So we continue, Robbie.
Should I continue? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I don't know if you heard nothing of the story, or
not very much. You should probably start from the beginning.
Start again. Okay. Sorry for this. Okay. So as I said, I will be talking about the Matadi-Kinshasa railway line in the DRC. But I will be focusing a little bit less on the contemporary appropriation of these infrastructures and rather stick to a more historical analysis. So the contemporary landscape does figure, but it's more as a sort of witness of these historical narratives that I want to bring to the fore. Of course, I'm not the first to talk about this railway line. And in particular, in the colonial period, numerous books were published on this railway, all glorifying the Belgian colonial achievement. And today, the history of this railway is remarkably still used in similar apologetic discourses of former colonials. The book on the left, published in 1993, but with a third volume published in 2000, is a case in point here. In the introduction, the author even explicitly states that, and I'm quoting, "The lesson that the builders of the railway line teach us about the Congo of Leopold II is that it was a well-administered nation where it was good to live for all of its inhabitants," end of quote. The book on the right then does something completely different. In his highly detailed work, Jules Marchal shows how during the official Belgian rule over Congo, similar cruelties than those of the Congo Free State continued to happen. For the reconstruction of the railway line in the 1920s, so he shows, Belgian colonials were still making use of forced labor, and numerous laborers died of extreme hardship. Now, despite the merits of Marchal's work, I would still formulate some criticism to this stance. Marchal, the story. The Europeans are cast as villains rather than as heroes. The history remains completely Eurocentric. And in both narratives, the African population is the helpless toy of colonialism. Such histories, I would argue, tend to obfuscate narratives of a more importantly, narratives of everyday resistance. Attention. So in my own research, line away from these binary narratives by looking beyond the periods of its gruesome construction. The installment of the railway line was, after all, a sort of catalyst for the industrialization of the Bakongo region after its installment, and numerous companies established themselves on lands adjacent to the newly installed railway line, introducing other forms of colonial violence in the rural landscapes along this line. Close scrutiny of these places not only surfaces these other forms of colonial violence, it also brings stories of everyday resistance to light. Now, this attention for the transformation of the landscape as an important research tool stems from the idea that, and I'm quoting Tim Ingold here, the embodied form of a complex web of interactions of those living in the landscape. And Ingold, a pattern of activities collapsed into an array of landscape features. The drastic change colonialism brought to the existing social-cultural structure can be traced in the changing landscape. Now, when I submitted my abstract almost 2 years ago, I still had the ambition to investigate several of these productive landscapes along the railway. But unfortunately, due to the pandemic, quickly after submitting the abstract, the archives closed their doors. So instead of focusing on numerous cases, I'm forced to return to one case that highlights the potential of closely studying such more rural areas, namely the land plant of Lukala. Now, for this paper, at first I tried to work with a strategy to visualize these transformations of landscape, similar to what I was planning to do for these other industrial sites. However, I was a bit disappointed by my own approach because these two-dimensional depictions do not even remotely view the imperial debris through Lukala as a landscape in the first place. So therefore, I decided instead my own photo points around which I could develop this narrative. Both photographs document a form of imperial debris in the landscape that can be directly related to a particular historical episode in the history of Lukala. I would like to start the episode that accompanies this first in 19. Of course, as centuries are crucial actors in the story as well. This illustrates that this is only a very brief fragment in the history of such a landscape. So in 1913, only 5 years after Belgium's takeover of the Congo Free State, the new Minister of Colonies, Jules Ronquin, was frustrated by the high price of building in the Belgian Congo. In particular, the lack of local building materials that were considered suitable by the colonial government turned the scaffolding of empire into an expensive matter. Now, only 10 days after complaining about it, Ronquin already came up with what he considered to be the ideal solution. He decided to send 2 geologists to the Belgian Congo with a clear brief, and I'm quoting, to explore the limestone basin of the Bas-Congo in order to assess the possibility of producing cement from its resources. The minister even urged the 2 scientists to focus on a quick and practical solution, and above all, not to waste too much time on pure science. Luckily for these geologists, the First World War broke out soon after their arrival in Congo, and in the confusions of the war periods, they were basically forgotten by the Belgian government in Europe. The Governor General in Congo, who had only received the instructions to facilitate their research, kept funding their project throughout the war, and despite the warning of the minister, the 2 immediately turned to pure science and started to analyze the complete geological formation of the Bas-Congo. Now, according to the scientists, however, they also acquitted themselves of their actual task, and by building on their geological insights, they scientifically derived the ideal location for a cement factory, here indicated by the blue dots on the new railway line. What is striking, if we look closer at the map, is that none of their own itineraries, which are indicated by these red lines, ever really crossed this particular region. And that as such, their indication of the ideal spot for cement production was only based on their scientific insights without ever even setting foot in the location they named Lukala after the river crossing tree. The Belgian industry, and in particular the Compagnie du Congo pour le Commerce et l'Industrie, who exploited the railway line, immediately jumped on top of these scientific conclusions. They established the Cimenterie du Congo, and they requested a concession for the land indicated by the scientists, and they describe it as a vacant land, and I'm quoting, without any value, a swampy jungle, without any woodlands, and without any villages. End of quote. Now, from the archival sources, it is a bit unclear if this was a deliberate lie to depict this land as vacant, but what is sure is that the by law obliged investigation into the local land rights showed that the region was anything but a vacant land. 3 villages intensively made use of the land for fishing, hunting, growing manioc, and so on. And a 4th village, the village of Kingu, which is located here, was even located on top of the requested land. But of course, the colonial government also provided a loophole in its protection of local land rights. And if the chiefs of these villages agreed, the African land rights could easily be bought off, of course, exactly what the Cimenterie du Congo decided to do. And I have to remark here that this is really a shady transaction, not in the least because the state agents organizing these sales of lands were quite prone to corruption, and was of course a sort of great imbalance between in the power structure between the three parties involved in such contracts. After paying off these chiefs, or at least after obtaining the contract you can see on your screen, the Cimenterie du Congo was sure that the concession would be granted, and they already started to construct their cement plant. In the end, however, it took the government 8 years to decide on the matter. In particular, the vice governor of the Congo Kasai province sided with the African inhabitants, trying to protect their lands. Of course, this was not out of moral reasons, but rather he used their concerns for his own agenda, since he was afraid that such an industrial activity would further strain his already depopulated and deforested province. Now, since the Cimenterie du Congo had already started to erect their factory, they were forced to turn to the land directly adjacent to their factory for the mining of limestone, land that was already owned by their mother company. Not only was the limestone on this part of land not so readily available as the two geologists had thought, but with the Lukala River so close by, mining was an extremely delicate operation, and several of the first limestone quarries flooded completely. So the results of these early failed attempts are a series of artificial lakes on the company grounds. To this date, the village chief of Kimiala considers the factory grounds his land stolen by the company. Even though it is forbidden for the villagers to enter the company grounds, one of my local respondents told me how they often went fishing in the lake, silently hidden in one of the bushes. On the second photograph, you can see the remains of the first cement kiln that the company started to build in 1921. Although it was only quite briefly operational, its skeleton is still towering above Lukala's landscape. As such, it is easy to understand why this piece of machinery became a recurrent motif in colonial literature. Time and again, travelers who passed the cement factory by train described it as a sort of industrial miracle in a Congolese terra nullius. The lyrical description of the industrial activity most often ended with the observation that this cement factory was built using the most modern of machinery. But in reality, the fact that this factory towered above its surroundings already gives away that the plant was not as modern as these travelers thought. In Europe and the United States, the vertical cement kiln had become completely obsolete and was replaced almost everywhere by a rotary kiln. The extremely dangerous working conditions and the high labor intensity could simply no longer be reconciled with ever stronger labor unions. Nevertheless, for their African endeavors, the Cimenterie du Congo was convinced that the vertical kiln's characteristics would be assets in Congo. First, because a vertical kiln could be fired using charcoal, something they thought to be abundantly available. But most importantly, they thought that labor in Congo was extremely cheap, easily available, and completely unable to speak up against the dangerous working conditions. Of course, these readily made assumptions turned out to be completely wrong. The vice governor of Congo Kasai not only stalled the company's concession request, also prohibited the company of making use of both the government's recruitment system and of any wood from the colony. As a result, the company had to rely on expensive immigrant labor from other colonies and on expensive imported fuel. As such, instead of an economic way of producing cement, the vertical kiln soon became a true financial nightmare. And combined with the troubles surrounding limestone excavation, the company was already on the edge of bankruptcy only a year after the erection of the kiln. And also the assumption that African laborers would be unable to speak up against dangerous working conditions quickly turned out to be wrong. When the director of the plant decided to cut the wages in an attempt to save the company, immediately a huge strike broke out. Although the cut in their wages was the immediate cause of the strike, there was an underlying dissatisfaction with the dangerous operating conditions of the vertical cement kiln. By projecting the archival information on the strike onto the physical structure of the town, it became clear that the laborers turned the physical barriers of the colonial racial segregation upside down. By occupying the only bridge between the African and European side of town, they could easily resist the European employees continuing the strike for several days. It was only after the arrival of the colonial army that the strike was violently slashed down. The alleged instigators of the riots, all immigrant laborers, were transported in chains to Matadi, from where they would be deported, and the other strikers were imprisoned for several days. Nevertheless, in the aftermath of this sentence, we can again see the strong political agency of the laborers. The humiliating treatment of their leaders and their own unjust imprisonment had only further infuriated them. They radically refused to go back to work, and they even turned the event into a highly political matter, writing several letters of protest to the consuls of France in the UK. Eventually, in an attempt to defuse the situation, the Simontori du Congo pleaded with the Governor General to annul the deportation of the instigators. And despite the strong protests of the local administrator, they were granted pardon and returned as heroes to Lukala on the 28th of October. Strengthened by these events, these employees claimed higher positions and they started a battle for better working conditions in a sort of Congolese labor union avant la lettre. And as a result, from the mid-1920s onwards, promises for investments in new rotary kilns start to appear in company reports. And although the first rotary kiln was eventually only installed by 1955, a new automated vertical kiln was installed in 1927 to meet the laborers' demands for safer and more humane working conditions. So to this date, the skeleton of the vertical kiln stands as a sort of industrial relic in the landscape, but combining it with this historical narrative, it starts to remind us of this struggle for better labor conditions of these different laborers. Now, as a sort of epilogue, I am glad that I can briefly show you some of the archival documents on one of these other companies along the railway line, the Compagnie Sucrière du Congo, that I have been able to access the last couple of weeks with the archives slowly reopening in Belgium. Now, although I could of course not investigate these files in detail yet, it is clear that the whole landscape was dramatically transformed. Irrigation canals were dug, fields were plowed, and a secondary railway network was installed. The whole territory got a new agricultural infrastructure completely aimed at the production of sugar. Now, when soon after this rotational crop system was also introduced, the transformation of the landscape becomes blatantly present. As you can see in these pictures, where you can see how the height of these plants is of course related to this rotational system, and since this changes year by year, each year you have a completely different transformation of the landscape as well. Now, although it is not visible in the plans drawn by the company, these plantations of course do not land in a vacant area. And like in Lukala, this transforming structure was projected over an existing network of local villages, pathways, manure fields, and so on. And ironically, in an internal note, the company took pride in the fact that, and I'm quoting, the company not only produced the whole region around its factories, completely equipping them from an agricultural and industrial point of view with model villages, roads, etc. And they even go on to say that they live in perfect friendship with the neighboring villages, who always find the most hospitable welcome and help with us. Now, if you look at the sort of massive impact these small transformations of Lukala in the landscape of Lukala already had on the local population, I think it's hard to believe that these kind of enormous transformations of landscape were warmly welcomed. And I would say that this case, and probably also a lot of the other cases of the companies that installed themselves along this railway line, will rather show us these different forms of colonial violence, but also the different strategies of everyday resistance to this colonial violence. So thank you for your attention.
Brilliant. Thanks, Robbie. Thanks for that presentation and some brilliant maps there. Ariana, you're up.
Thanks, Joel. I just wanted to ask Melissa, should we keep the videos off for everyone, or what must I do?
Ariana, you're welcome to keep your video on during presenting.
Okay.
If this interferes with the presentation, then you'll switch it off. Yes, you're good to go.
Okay. So I just noticed it's a bit dark in my. So wait. I'm trying to share my screen, but first. Okay, there. Sorry, share screen. Okay, can you all see it?
Perfectly, yeah.
So earlier today in the second session on reimaginings, Adima Davis spoke about the importance about decolonization, or rather what she called anti-colonialism, not in abstract terms, but as an act of resistance. And as a historian of South Africa's liberation struggle in my paper, I look at one experience of anti-colonial resistance, which targeted the colonial infrastructure and landscape. This is the sabotage campaign that was waged by Mkhonto we Sizwe in the early 1960s. I was going to also look at kind of how this develops later on into propaganda in relation to People's War in the 70s and 80s, but I'm not going to do that in the presentation. I hope to do that as I further develop the paper. So on the night of Saturday, the 16th of December, 1961, a series of synchronized bomb explosions, the police recorded 12 of them, rocked the South African cities of Johannesburg and Gqeberha, formerly Port Elizabeth, signaling the launch of a new organization, Mkhonto we Sizwe, or MK, the Spear of the Nation in both isiZulu and isiXhosa. Formed by the leaders of the underground African National Congress and the South African Communist Party, MK announced that it would continue the struggle for freedom and democracy by new methods, marking a break from the non-violence of the previous decades. Its targets, however, were not people, but buildings of the apartheid government, infrastructure, and other symbols of oppression. The homemade bombs set off on the 16th of December were accompanied by posters that warned of planned attacks against government installations, particularly those connected with the policy of apartheid and race discrimination. As one of MK's founding members later explained, we would hit at all the symbols of apartheid, but under no circumstances were we to kill or maim members of the population. Ours was not a terrorist organization. The real terrorists were the all-white government and its supporters. December the 16th had been deliberately chosen for MK to make its dramatic entry into the fight against apartheid. It was celebrated by the apartheid state as the Day of the Vow, or the Day of the Covenant, or Dingane's Day, to mark the defeat of the Zulu, led by Dingane at the hands of Boer settlers at the Battle of Blood River in 1938. For the African majority, the date symbolized the loss of their land and their freedom, but also was one of pride in terms of African resistance against settler colonialism and a rallying point against oppression. These events are fairly well known. December the 16th continued to be commemorated during the liberation struggle as Heroes' Day by the ANC, and has become a public holiday, Reconciliation Day post-apartheid. But what about the targets? There seems to be little public memory today of the physical targets of sabotage in this period, in spite of their symbolic value at the time and the psychological effect that they were intended to achieve. I wonder how many people would be able to name one of the physical targets of MK's first attacks on December the 16th. And the image that would probably come to mind to most people is that of a fallen electric pylon, which is on your screen. This image is from the the Bailey's African History Archives and was taken by a drum photographer, but it's actually not from MK's opening act. Here's another one. And another one. On December the 16th, 1961, in Johannesburg, it was the Pass Office building in Ferreirasdorp, the Fordsburg Post Office on Central Road, which still exists today, and the nearby Bantu Commissioner's Court that were hit, along with the office of the Portuguese curator on Market Street, which has largely become forgotten. This was responsible for issuing passes to Mozambican workers that worked in South Africa. Oh, sorry, I put them in the wrong order. I meant to show you this one. This is a photo. It's the only photo of MK's launch attacks that I've been able to trace. It's an image of a Fordsburg Pass Office that was published in the Rand Daily Mail, where a homemade bomb shattered the windows and blew up the front entrance. You can see the door on the floor, even though the image is not great. The whites only entrance of the post office, and there's a policeman inside looking at the clock, which gives the time took place 10:20 in the evening. In Soweto, the municipal offices in Dube, the resettlement board offices in Meadowlands, and the Pirima post office in Orlando West were blasted. There were 5 more explosions in Port Elizabeth that damaged electricity transformers in the suburbs of Brickmakers Kloof and Framelsey, and in the township of New Brighton, the Bantu Labour Administration and Education Department's offices were attacked. The reasons for the turn to violence or the turn to armed struggle are multiple and complex, and they've been the subject of much debate in the historiography of MK over the decades. Recently, Simon Stevens has drawn attention to the specific form of violence that the founders of MK initially adopted, and that's urban sabotage. While I don't necessarily agree with his broader arguments around what he thinks was the determining factor in the turn to violence, which he argues also affected its form, I want to take his point about the choice of sabotage tactics further to focus on the targets of MK in the first few years of its existence, which scholars haven't paid much attention to. Ostensibly, sabotage aimed to bring the government and its supporters to their senses, in other words, to pressurize it to engage in negotiations, and thus MK's manifesto claimed to, they sought to avoid a civil war along racial lines. This is a copy of MK Manifesto, of the MK Manifesto. Copies of this were put up by Congress movement supporters during the night of MK's operations. So, the idea was that the next morning the public would learn about the attacks and the reasons for them, and who was responsible for this. According to Rusty Bernstein, who was a Communist Party member that was involved in the political preparations for MK's launch, most of the posters were actually taken down by the police before the morning, and so the MK manifesto warning of an impending civil war were effectively blacked out. In reality, we know that MK leaders, and notably amongst them its first commander-in-chief, Nelson Mandela, didn't see sabotage as an end in itself or as a freestanding tactic, but rather as a preliminary phase of armed resistance that would eventually escalate to guerrilla warfare. But the plan for this transition from urban sabotage to rural-based guerrilla warfare was laid out in another document, Operation Maibuye, which was confiscated by the police at Lily's Leaf in Rivonia during the raid, during the famous raid, and which was used as damning evidence at the Rivonia trial. But for guerrilla warfare, MK needed material resources and trained personnel, and they would have to seek help from abroad. So in January 1962, only a month after the launch of MK, Mandela, as its commander-in-chief, secretly left South Africa to travel the continent and enlist the support of African countries for the arms struggle, as well as secure military training for recruits and undergoing training in guerrilla warfare himself. Indeed, looking back to the launch of MK on occasion of its 25th anniversary in 1986, Joe Slovo wrote, "Among the lot of us, we did not have a single pistol. No one we knew had ever engaged in urban sabotage with or homemade explosives. While a small number of white communists involved in MK's early stages had been in the army and served in the Second World War, Black South Africans had been deliberately deprived of the skills of modern warfare and access to weaponry. The homemade bombs that were used in MK's launch operations on the 16th of December were quite rudimentary. They were a mix of potassium permanganate, aluminium, and glycerin, and manufactured in the Hillbrow flat of Jack and Rika Hodgson, which became known as Johannesburg's bomb factory. Both of them were members of the Communist Party, and Jack was a war veteran that had served in the North African campaign. And at the time, he was MK's expert on explosives, including manufacturing, testing, and training of MK units. Gradually, units started to use dynamite that was either smuggled from the mines by sympathetic mine workers or stolen from sites such as road construction sites. But yeah, just to say that under these circumstances, it's clear that the main aims of MK's sabotage campaign had to be necessarily be symbolic. In his handwritten notes of his Africa trip, which included a visit to the camps of the Algerian National Liberation Front, Mandela recorded spectacular and successful attacks by the revolutionaries enabled the Algerian people to recover their dignity. Joe Modise, who was part of the Johannesburg High Command and later became MK's commander-in-chief and Minister of Defense in the new democratic South Africa, recalled the first explosions as the happiest moment in my life. According to Ibrahim, a member of the Natal High Command that ended up being captured and imprisoned, serving on Robben Island, The emergence of Mkhonto weSizwe in 1961 sparked off lots of enthusiasm among the people. Its acts of sabotage resulted in many people coming forward in search of MK, and most of the people who came wanting to join the organization was subsequently sent out for military training. By 1966, approximately 600 MK cadres had been trained abroad in countries that ranged from Algeria, Ethiopia, Egypt, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and others. So everything from the date of MK's launch to the targets of sabotage was intentionally selected to have a maximum impact, given that the number of people that were initially involved in the attacks was small, their resources were limited, and they lacked training. Mandela's notes, which were also confiscated by the police at Rivonia, and ensured that he was one of the accused in the Rivonia trial, as they proved his connection to MK. Anyway, his notes further explain that sabotage could be hot, which essentially meant blowing up something, or cold, for example, cutting wires and cables. It could be directed internally, meaning within the Congress movement's constituency, or externally against the state and its supporters. In turn, targets of external sabotage actions could be economic or symbolic. But it's important to note at this stage, there were no military targets. Stevens argues that although MK initially experimented with some cold, externally directed sabotage, it quickly turned its focus to hot or big bang operations. Yet, while some of his operations were indeed spectacular, see the pylons I showed at the beginning, one of the remarkable aspects of a sabotage campaign is the number of attacks that were carried out as part of what was really a low-key and a low-key rolling campaign, whose story has largely remained untold. The explosions on the 16th of December were widely reported in the South African newspapers, but ongoing sabotage operations were not fully covered in the press, with the exception of the Congress movement-aligned New Age, which reported positively on the formation of MK and sabotage attacks, and some of whose journalists were themselves involved in MK. New Age, however, was closed down at the end of 1962. Anyway, the lack of reporting was because of a mixture of censorship, both from the state and self-imposed by the media, and the alleged limited impact of the attacks. Newspaper photographs of sabotage actions are even harder to come by, including in the New Age. The first and only photograph of sabotage in the New Age were published in November 1962 after a big operation carried out by Ibrahim, Ronnie Kasrils, Bruno Mtolo, but later became state witness, and Billy Nye. This involved blowing up several electricity pylons just outside of Durban, which plunged the entire Durban area into darkness. And the next day, Ibrahim that then worked for the New Age, decided to go back to the site and take photographs of the pylons. So these are the only two photographs of the entire sabotage campaign, that appeared in New Age. the most comprehensive list of MK's sabotage operation between its launch in December 1961 and the Rivonia raid of July 1963 is annexure of the Rivonia trial indictment. Although it's not entirely accurate and it's difficult to know, to sort out which of the operations are those conducted by other groups, notably the National Committee for Liberation, that later armed resistance movement, but also employed similar sabotage tactics. But anyway, there are 193 incidents recorded in this document, including the location, date, time, and brief description of each of the attacks. While there are a few exceptional cases, the most recurring objects of sabotage are telephone cables, electricity pylons and substations, railway tracks and signals. And I thought I should share some photos that connect me to the other papers on railways. So this one is of a railway outside of Alberton, south of Joburg, after 11 coaches had been derailed in February 1963. And these are, I suppose, the irony of it is that low-paid black workers were in the end put to work to repair the damage done by the attacks. And then this one I think is an image of a sabotage attack in Durban at Victoria Bridge. This took place on the second anniversary of Sharpeville on the 21st of March 1963. And Ibrahim again was one of the members of the unit that carried out this operation, and remembers going, walking past the site the next day and seeing people crowding the area and watching over the lines. So I think he's referring to this picture.
You want to start wrapping up, please, Ariana?
Sorry?
Start wrapping up.
Yes, yeah, I'm finished. So the other buildings, the pass office, so the other recurring targets in the list in the Rivonian indictment are pass offices and other offices of the departments of Bantu administration and education, post offices which had segregated services and also sometimes housed native courts within. Then it was government beer halls, as well as a few private dwellings and buildings that were associated with those perceived to be government collaborators. So a lot of these attacks happened in the Eastern Cape, where the Transkei Bantustan had been set on the road of independence. Anyway, it's perhaps unsurprising that many of these buildings and installations have fallen into oblivion, and that it's the spectacular acts that we tend to remember today, the electricity pylons that have been photographed mostly. The vast majority of the buildings that were targeted during the sabotage campaign were not chosen for their architectural or historical value, but rather they were selected because of their implication in carrying out the everyday bureaucracy of apartheid. But while these buildings, where they still survived, may have been rid of their racist and oppressive functions, what about their history? And in terms of the infrastructure, the transport and economic infrastructure that was the target of sabotage, which the democratic South Africa has inherited from the apartheid state, how has this been transformed and developed to serve and benefit the majority of South Africans? I'm going to end there.
Thanks, Ariana. Brilliant stuff. Okay, so let's open up for questions, either by putting your hand up or if you put a question in the chat. I'll just try and get back. Maybe if some of our presenters have questions they'd like to pose. Otherwise, I have got a question, Ariana, about reporting, which I found really interesting, about the sort of the censorship that you mentioned. But what I sort of saw in the 80s in some of the local newspapers that I'm looking at in the Northern Transvaal is, you know, it's very difficult to stop people from jumping to the conclusion that the terrorists might be involved when there's a train accident outside of town. And so what I really found interesting was how, like, there's and I guess something of the success of the campaign was that they managed to turn all infrastructure into a sort of, you know, an accident waiting to happen or terrorism waiting to happen. Everything became suspect. So it was the bolts that they had to get an engineer from Pretoria to come and assess whether the bolts had been fiddled with and whether it was the terrorists who were doing it. So really interested about that kind of, you know, there's only so much you can stop people from. And at the same time, also the apartheid state in some ways trying to foster that kind of security psychosis, you know, that terror, like that the terrorists were really there at the door. And I wonder if there's some periodization around that, whether that's a kind of 1980s genre of state propaganda that not so much a question, but anyway. Got anybody else?
Luke's hand is up.
Luke, thanks.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, everyone. Ariana, my question is for you also. That, you know, there's often this sort of suggestion that there are different types of armed struggle, and some of the armed struggle is armed propaganda, and other types of struggle have more sort of strategic aims to do with the effect on the state and the way that they operate. And I'm wondering if at this time the selection of targets had more to do with the one or the other, because it seems like these big infrastructural targets might be more noticeable to the state. It's more easy for them to cover up why some power has gone out, rather than say if there's a sort of a local house that's been blown up in an area and people see that, or pass office or something like that. I mean, what is the strategy around this?
Thanks, Luke. Do you want to respond, Ariana?
I see George's hand is also up. I don't know if you want to take a round, otherwise I can respond.
Sure, Georgia, let's do it. Sorry, I can't see the hands.
I would have another topic, so please stay with
okay.
Okay.
All right.
Before we...
So, you know, I think the interesting thing about it is that all of his actions were ultimately not intended to have a military or outcome, but it was the sabotage and later the armed propaganda to a large extent, although, you know, by then the category of kind of legitimate targets had been importantly expanded to include the military. And in fact, a lot of the action of MK activities were against, you know, also military installations, which in this period certainly MK did not, the capacity would not have had to the capacity to sustain. But that, you know, that the message was kind of always, it was about a political message. And I think the newspapers, I mean, with the exception of the New Age, but, you know, all the mainstream media and newspapers appeared to, you know, may have reported on the attacks, but not on the message. So yeah. And in terms of the effects, I think, you know, as I was trying to explain, there were that they, you know, they had different types of target in mind, and the state and its infrastructure was certainly one of them, and the audience for those attacks was the state and its white supporters, let's say. But then there are other types of activities that would have been directed internally at its own supporters and at the kind of South Africa's oppressed rather than the oppressor. They may have been actions in response to, you know, targeting buildings within certain communities because of the role that they performed, or actions, including on infrastructure that may have been in support of, again, workers or communities. So, you know, it was both. But we remember the ones mostly that had more spectacular effects. So, you know, the Durban pylons, because Durban went, you know, completely dark for some hours, and the smaller ones we don't remember. But as I was saying, what's remarkable is the amount of actions that they were able to undertake in this period under these really difficult conditions.
Thanks, Ariana. Giorgio, do you want to raise your question?
Yes, it's more, I would like to try to link a little bit what we said now, with what we discussed earlier today. So this question of heritage and the question of the museum. So this morning we heard a wonderful paper about the collapsing museum in BE. We heard examples of, I would call them bottom-up museums, struggling that there is, in a way, no interest in these museums by the people. It's really intellectual projects, certain museums, and there are other examples we haven't discussed today. Now we have this huge railway heritage in South Africa. And what is interesting, and that was a topic amongst the colonial rule, the railway heritage was closely linked to specific modernity, it was linked to whiteness, it was linked to progress, etc. And the colonial state pushed railway heritage in a way to celebrate that in certain museums, which are now, except for purely technical museums, are starting to crumbling and collapsing. And what was interesting for us, if you look, how do people deal with this collapsing heritage or this railway heritage? And for instance, in there is no initiative to build up a museum. The central state is for sure not interested to build up a museum in there. The provincial state doesn't have the money to build up a museum in there. So it would have to come out of the community. And there's no interest. And there are other places like Uzakos, where you have an interest in a local museum, in a museum dealing with railways. And for me, I think that's really interesting when thinking about this railway heritage, that in some places it triggers something among people, amongst residents, and in other places it does not. And I don't speak of tomorrow we will have a presentation from the railway station in Maputo, the new museum. That again is very much a top-down project. I think it's a beautiful museum and I really liked it. I visited it, but this is a top-down project where the state presents itself funded by the European Union. And again, what Rodi, I always say, Dodi, Enrico Dodi said, he mentioned in his overview that in Xai-Xai there are old steam locomotives, and maybe that's a possibility to make them function again to attract tourists. And I would like to ask him, for instance, what do people in Xai-Xai think about that? Who has the plan to put them on the tracks again, these little steam engines, and for whom? Okay, I stop. I just wanted to link things a little bit.
Thanks, Giorgio. Enrico, do you want to respond to that question? Is Enrico still with us? Okay.
Okay. The railway is starting from Xai-Xai toward the province of Inhambane on the northeast is a very old railway. It was almost totally destroyed by the floods of the beginning of this century. So the railway is no more operating. There is a small station, and the infrastructures, the building and the areas, the land is still owned by CFM, the Mozambican Railways Company. And there is some rolling stock which has not been operating for a number of years. So I just mentioned the possibility of creating a new small museum, because Xai-Xai is a tourist, besides being the capital of the province, is a tourist town, because it's not far from the sea, and the coast, the entire coast of the Gaza province has a lot of beaches, lagoon, and is a high potential tourist area. So in this context, a small museum could perhaps to succeed. There is a new airport being built nearby. So if we think in terms, as we did when we prepared the plan, if we think in terms of a comprehensive project, what we call in Portuguese rotas turísticas, tourist itineraries, and a tourist that combines international tourism and domestic tourism, seasides, sea resorts, and historical monuments, which are, number of them are there, post-independence, because both Eduardo Mondlane, the first president of Frelimo, and Samora Machel were born in that area. So there are a lot of elements. If we think in terms of a tourist cultural program and plan covering a huge, vast area, I'm not mentioning the national parks because they are a bit far away, but not too far, then a small museum in Xai Xai could succeed. But of course, if it is built as just a museum in itself, perhaps I agree, it won't succeed. It won't have much impact on the area, on the city.
Thanks, Enrico. We have a question in the chat from Tara Weber, who says, besides a museum or a restoration, what other possibilities are there for this infrastructure? Are there solutions that fall outside our tendency to monumentalize the past? And I think this sort of links to an earlier discussion that was going on in the chat about how we have this tendency to sequester elements of our history and put it in a building for people to go and visit. But so I'm wondering if, I guess that's for anybody in the panel. How would you respond to that? Maybe those working with the museums.
I don't know, or Robbie? Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, in our example, that's kind of the question, you know, that emerges. So we try to compare. So the paper goes into a bit more detail, even though it's also just a draft, than the presentation that we've had. But what we try to do is sort of speak of how, you know, this tendency to monumentalize is, of course, something that was very much pushed by the apartheid government, for example, and especially in the peripheries of sort of what the government envisioned as a greater South Africa. So in Namibia, but also then in inner South African peripheries. So the question becomes sort of, what do you do with this massive infrastructure? Because on the one hand, there is sort of this idea of, yes, let's create other sort of museums and monuments and stuff, but just with different narratives. But they always have the inherent risk, I think, of still sort of feeding this idea that, as Joel also has said, of sort of freezing these things in the past. So I think on the one hand, it's sort of an open topic. There is no one-way solution, because of course it's understandable if a town wants to generate some revenue and interest, especially the towns that we looked at. Uzakos is a very small town. They try to do different things with these ruins, but on the other hand, they try also to attract visitors. But the other thing I would say, the alternative is just to leave that stuff and to do something else, which is sometimes due to lack of investment, but sometimes an active choice that people do to just ignore these monumental sort of colonial remnants out of spite or out of wanting to do something completely different. And I think that's a refreshing thing that we should also look at. We should look at examples where nothing happens with things. And I think that also links a little bit to, you know, Aliana's topic, because of course there's a long tradition of anger towards these sort of massive infrastructural plans by the government, because resistance then goes along those lines, you know, of disrupting these projects. So yeah, I think there's not sort of really an answer, at least from my side, to Tara's proposition, but I think it's important to think of these dimensions that go beyond monumentalizing beyond museums, while at the same time still accepting that that's a valid that's a valid solution for places to sort of engage with their past through objects, through monuments, and so on and so forth.
So Robbie, did you have an input?
Yeah, perhaps I think in the case of Lucala, for instance, where you have, for instance, this huge vertical cement plant that is completely out of use and just has been standing there for decades. I think this intuitively, this is a sort of interesting way of dealing with this as well, and just to kind of leave them as you just said. But also, and this maybe adds a little bit to that sort of narrative. I think that for me, what was interesting to do in this project is to really start to surface or to bring these different historical narratives to the fore, through which some of these relics that are just standing there get more meaning. So that's perhaps my take on this.
Right, thanks. We have 10 more minutes. I think Itala, do you want to say something? I see your video is on. Itala, did you want to say?
Itala, yes. I have a question for Arianna. I was wondering, how are these sabotage by the MK documented? What do you know? Do we know about the way they were organized and brought about? Are there inner narrations from the MK people, or do we have only the police records or records, or what? Because it's part of a very adventurous story. I wanted to mention here there is a very famous short story by Nadine Gordimer, who retells a sabotage, an MK sabotage near Johannesburg. Very interesting. I mean, builds upon growing anxiety for those who were organizing it. So I'm wondering what kind of documents and tales and narrations are there?
Thanks, Itala. So the police reports say are quite good at kind of providing details about these actions. You know, the where, the when, and what materials was used, what the explosives were, what the damage was. But then, yeah, they don't say anything about the people that were involved and what made them choose particular targets, what the kind of reconnaissance work that was done before was, how operations may have been evaluated afterwards. And that mostly comes, there is, you know, I think that mostly comes from the narratives of those that participated in those operations themselves. Probably starting, you know, from Mandela's own autobiography to various others. One of the recent ones that's been published, for example, was of Ronnie Kasral's book on his wife Eleanor, which was the first woman saboteur in MK. And who was arrested, you know, was part of operations in the Durban area, and was subsequently arrested and orchestrated their own escape from prison. And so, those are the narratives where the, you know, the motives and the ideas of the people that were involved really come through. But literature, thanks for the reference, is always another good source for this kind of information. Yeah.
Fascinating. Kasunda, I see you've got quite a long comment. I'm wondering if you want to ask it in person.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I was
Okay.
going on and on. Been a long day. I was just wondering to see. I mean, it's a little bit different from what the two speakers were talking about in terms of the bigger South African railway infrastructure from here to Namibia, but this decline in domestic infrastructure. I've seen reports of railway stations in parts of Johannesburg metropolitan, like Benoni, being turned into informal settlements, and there's a lot of nostalgia around that. You know, when I was a kid, I used to take a train from this stop. So I'm wondering how you'd interpret that in terms of I don't know if you saw the earlier paper I was referring to from Guinea-Bissau, Living from Ruins, how local people are repurposing these spaces.
Shall I start answering?
Go for it, yeah, please.
So it is, I saw your comment that, and it's very interesting. So, but one thing we have to say first, we mainly worked in rural areas. And in rural areas, you have to traveled along many railway lines and stations. And there you have this reappropriation of an old railway building. But basically nobody cares. So South African Railways doesn't, or now Transnet doesn't care what happened with the lines they closed. And if it's not right in the middle of the town, people, even the local town doesn't really care, so you can then move in. Maybe there are small fights, but it's not important, and it's in a way it's not important. Nobody uses or can use this building because there are too many, or it's in the wrong place, or too many buildings in decay standing around, like for instance in Usakos. And the second thing is this nostalgia with the railway and the specific reasons why South African Railways declined so rapidly. If we have a broader picture, it was one of the most powerful railway companies, don't want to say in the world, but not only in Africa. And they kept an extreme tight control on all traffic until the 1970s. So they had a monopoly controlling the traffic. That is what many environmental activists would wish today, let's say in Europe or in the US. So you have to use public transport, but at the same time, the railways, they had a strict segregation, more or less right from the beginning, and they were extremely unpopular amongst the black passengers. And when they lost this transport monopoly in the 1970s, so people could choose between private transport, taxis, and whatever. So that's, and for instance, on the long passenger traffic, long distance passenger traffic, that's amazing, but that's completely collapsed in South Africa. It's almost non-existent. So that's maybe another point to this nostalgia.
Thanks, Giorgio. We've only got time for one more question. I think I want to take Ruth Sachs's question in the chat. It's for Robbie. Ruth asks, could you talk more about the concrete relics as something that cannot be used for another purpose? I ask in the context of the current day situation of the relics of the railway. For example, in Mbanza and Gungu, old railway structures are still in use, even if the trains no longer follow the original line. Robbie, do you have a response for that? Okay.
Sorry. So I think that a lot of these relics from the railway line that are directly related to the sort of operation of the railway line are still in use. So I've been to visit some things like the stone crushing plant that was used for the ballasts underneath the train tracks, and these things are still in use. Also, the most of the labor camps, for instance, are still inhabited today. So that's something else probably. But then the concrete relics, so for instance, this cement kiln, is out of use because it's very dangerous to enter the building because it can collapse at any time. So there are still some parts of the building that are still used as a sort of warehouse to store cement in. Most of the buildings, or most of this part of the building is not in use anymore. And so, yeah, but in a way, the fact that it still stands there as a sort of monument without necessarily being perceived as one by a lot of these local inhabitants is somehow an interesting thing, I would say. But maybe could you explain a little bit more about why you mentioned Mbanza and Gungu as structures that are still in use as a sort of counterexample of what I've been discussing? Or
maybe we should take it to the chat because we are out of time, and I see there's a number of other questions in the chat, especially from Maria. Sorry, Maria, I haven't fitted you in. And Luke also had a question, and maybe he wants to put that in the chat. But I think we should wrap up this panel. It's been a long day. So thanks very much, everybody. I think there's Hilton is just going to be giving some concluding remarks. So please stick around for that. I think we'll go straight into that.
Is it me or is it Ali? Ali, are you there?
Yes, I am there.
Sorry.
That's great. Then it's you, Ali.
You're right.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And also let me take this opportunity to thank all the panelists and the program facilitators. It has been a long day, and the contributions have been diverse, very rich. As questions were asked, yet more questions came up that needed to be further explored. And I'm sure those will also be explored tomorrow, as well as day after tomorrow, as we go back to consolidate our papers, hopefully for publication. What I will do just for a short period now as a form of summation, I will not mention the panelists by name so that I do not mention others and leave others. Also, I will not go regurgitate what was said and the questions raised, but will just attempt to identify similarities, differences, and continuities that cuts across all the presentations. Indeed, as I said, The presentations were diverse, they were complex, but also in many ways they complemented one another, just as they problematized the very diverse views of the presenters. There were interesting overarching themes, and these ranged from the colonial function or colonial texts of gardens, of parks, of railways, of buildings, of churches, of decor. And in unpacking these texts, the various presenters engaged themes of power, whether it is power of the state or the colonizing power, the power of countering the state, themes of naming, themes of categorization, as well as the dominant themes of civilizing the other, and how civilizing the other emerges, whether we're talking about parks, whether we're talking about monuments, whether we're talking about railway. Naturally, in a conversation of this sort, contestation would be expected, and indeed it has emerged as counter themes of the colonial text on one hand. But also what is important for me is that the presentations were not a binary. It was not the good versus the bad, the colonizer versus the colonized. There were contradictions and contestations within the text of colonialism itself and how it manifested itself. There were contradictions pointed out in what was referred to as resistance or decolonization or decolonial theories, so that these are processes that are understood not to be moving along a straight line, but they move in different direction, like a river, come back and go into different directions yet again. There was, of course, contestations on the notions of space and its use. And there were interesting examples made, the use of people's parks in the 80s, but that argument was taken further to say post-1994, there is a different notion of people's parks as people invade, in inverted commas, and restructure and reconfigure parks that are presented from above. What I missed in the context of parks is that parks and gardens as a colonial narrative were articulated clearly in terms of what ideological narrative they were articulating. One missed an understanding of what are the philosophical perspectives of the makers of parks in post-1994. Yes, there was an acknowledgement that probably that would be found within the understanding of community consultation. Community consultation too was an area that was problematized. First, the very notion of community is not as straightforward as the word seems. Within a community, there are many communities. And this, in fact, affects the very idea of public consultation. Various presenters tended to argue, of course, that there was little consultation, which is the reason why some of the memorials and monuments are vandalized, or frustrations on the fault lines of neoliberalism are vented on these monuments. However, when you read and go into the archives of the makers of these monuments, they will indicate several public meetings that were supposedly held with people. And even in these meetings, it is not progressive or liberatory perspectives that are articulated. Communities on the ground do want these fascist, larger-than-life monuments and statues and building, because there is one ideological perspective that sees development as bricks and mortar. And it looks at nuanced memorialization as degrading the triumphalism of the liberation struggle. The concept of indigeneity as a form of contestation also emerged. Before I make just the two comments on the indigeneity, I just want to point out that what is interesting is that the latest white paper on arts, culture, and sports and recreation, which was adopted by Cabinet towards the end of last year, 2020, has consciously moved away from the concept indigenous knowledge, and they have adopted local knowledges. Part of the rationale is that the notion indigenous, though it was explained in the context of what it would mean when it refers to plants, but once it refers to people, it pushes you into a biological reflection of societies, as opposed to looking at the developments of social societies and its conflicts as social constructs. What is also interesting is that there has been very little contestation of this move away from indigenous knowledge to local knowledges, partly an indication of the lack of contestation and engagement with policy direction 20 years or 25 years down the line. I know I'm left with 5 minutes, and there were still quite a number of other areas. The question of nostalgia came up in two interesting ways. There was a reading of the presentations as not being engaging with nostalgia, but there was a fight back that interpreted nostalgia in different ways and complex ways, which we can explore further. There was on the presentation of MK and its attack on the infrastructure, which was a colonizing infrastructure, and MK seems to be an uprooting infrastructure. One wonders whether its absence in the mapping of heritage sites is because it would negate the ideology of reconciliation and peace, that there is a tendency to underplay armed struggle. It is even interesting that the presenter referred to Mandela as the first commander-in-chief of MK, something that is no longer acknowledged, as he is deliberately framed as a person of peace, as a protector of the rainbow that has disappeared. Then, of course, there's the questions of the statues of the past refusing to disappear. As people were presenting, I don't know whether you did pick up that the Oxford University has made a decision that the statue of Rhodes will not fall. Of course, it will be interesting post this conference to understand what is their argument, but this is again just a living reality of how the past continues in the present and the present in the past. Maybe the last point I should make is just a question on whether the colleagues who presented on the developments of Gaza as in Mozambique, have lessons to draw on the presentation of the memory boom that characterized South Africa from 1994, which saw the emergence of museums, memorials, renaming of streets, and the fault lines that have been articulated so well in terms of under-resourcing, failure to repair the built environment and the parks, as well as challenges of communities who may have been consulted, as I want to argue, but have now suddenly turned around. And the last point is on the question that was raised. There are 2 points I would have loved to go deeper into, but just to mention quickly in passing, the interesting biographies of the church, the Dutch Reformed Church, and its life's histories, how it drew from the ideology of Afrikanerdom and later became a home of the Islamic faith, and also the biography of the making of Cornhill and the behind the scenes contestation, the power again here, not of the state, but the power of the judges to determine what needed to be retained and what needed to be removed. And within that context, there is probably also an interesting question of what is the space for new generations, whether they are architects, they are memory makers, to lay a different layer of narrative post-1994, post all the histories of the site, like Cornhill, which then grapples with the issues of development versus conservation. I think I would like to end it here, and not sure whether I need to hand back to Melissa to just indicate quickly about tomorrow, though it is written in the program. On my side, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ali. And thank you very much to all our speakers and to everyone who hung on till the end. Thank you very much for a successful day. We will kick off tomorrow. I plan to open the room at 8 o'clock to engage with our speakers for the first session. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks. And bye-bye.
Bye.